My previous Leaky Weirs have worked pretty well. This one was built with logs and clay and a few rocks, but it does have the problem that it leaks a little bit quicker than what I would like. This Leaky Weir works very well. It doesn't leak too quickly. It was built with, I dug a big hole to provide material for the wall. Then I dug a trench through the wall, put in a plastic membrane, backfilled the trench, then put shade cloth over the whole thing with topsoil, and it had been planted up so that all the things that grow on it root through the shade cloth, which holds it all together so that it doesn't erode when water flows over the top. The only issue with this type of construction is that you need something like a backhoe to build it, and it wouldn't be very economical to rent a backhoe to get somebody in to do it, because the work is quite intricate and stuff. So it's a good form of construction if you own a backhoe, but for those that don't, it would be quite expensive to try and make. Trying to address the imperfections of the previous type weirs, this is the next incarnation of my Leaky Weirs. It's built of concrete. It's basically a concrete retaining wall. I use a trench digger that's capable of digging a trench about 6 inches wide and 800 millimeters deep, so it's 150 by 800 millimeters deep. Then I build formwork over the whole thing. I put reinforcing inside the formwork and then get in a concrete truck and filled up with concrete. Now this has worked really well, as you can see. The trick is to use a laser level and get the top of the concrete as close to level as you possibly can. And as you can see, it leaks over the whole surface all the way around, so it spreads out the amount of flow. So it's not perfect. Some places it flows over a little bit quicker than in others. One beauty of it is that you can put holes through the wall that you can connect pipes to if you want to distribute the water elsewhere. And the beauty of this wall is that the wall itself doesn't really leak, but you get seepage under the wall and around the wall. At the moment it's overflowing, of course, so you're getting plenty of water coming around it. But even when it's seeping, it transfers water via seepage out into the surrounding area. So this particular weir I built last year. It took about 3 months to drain after the rain had filled it, but because most of the water is actually stored in the surrounding soils rather than in the weir itself, such that when this weir emptied after about 3 months, the area around it, which would have been 10 times the size of the weir itself, stayed green for a further 6 months. So even though the weir was empty, for 6 months it was still hydrating, or at least had the water was stored in the soils, surrounding soils. And the interesting thing is you can tell that because the type of things that are growing changes. Because there was more water in the soil here, I got this little herb growing that hadn't grown before, and I got some flowers, some little wildflowers growing. So whenever you're doing something that's going to hydrate the soil or change the fertility of the soil, you can tell whether it's working or not because what grows changes. You get seeds that are already in the soil or brought in by birds or something or other. They come up and you get weeds and things growing that didn't grow there before. So you get a direct feedback to see whether what you're doing is working. And in this area here you can see, well, at the moment we've just had some good rain, so things have greened up a bit, but even so the area you can see here is still quite green, whereas when you get to an area that's not being watered by that weir, you can see that the quality of what's growing there is not as lush. So we're now a fair way away from the weir and high enough above it so that the water from the weir is not really reaching this sort of an area. We've got lots of green growth at the moment because of the rain, but the difference would be much more noticeable, was much more noticeable before the rain had actually started. Now we'll go and have a look at my latest weir. This concrete weir was only completed a couple of weeks ago, just before the wet season. It's bigger than the last one. This one is 1.2 meters high. The amount of work involved in the formwork is pretty big, and also trying to pour that much concrete would have put too much pressure on the formwork, so I did it in 2 pours. If you look in closely here, you can see the line where the first pour joins the second pour. Now you can see how it's leaking. Water is coming over it all along it. You can see pipes through that are blocked off at the moment that could be connected to pipes if I want to. That's the beauty of this form of construction, is it gives you the option of controlling where the water that is coming out of the weir goes to. So at this end of the weir, this is the end of the weir which is closest to my orchard. It's a little bit lower so that a little bit more water can flow over it. And then this is the end of the weir here. So the concrete finishes there. If we look back, we can see how the land slopes and the weir gets higher and higher as we get down to there. And up here I've just got it so that overflow from the weir is actually flowing around the weir and into the surrounding soil so that it soaks in. Now the idea of that is that it's recharging the groundwaters to water my orchard. You can see it's quite an overgrown style of orchard because we're using the natural way of doing things. The construction method I use for this type of weir is you've got the potential that water flowing over the weir could cause a lot of erosion on the other side because it falls. So what I've done is, this weir is not quite completed because it hasn't been seeded and the grass grown like the other one was. You could see on the other weir that the grasses had grown up really well and the water was just falling into the grass, which is all held together by the shade cloth. So you can see a little bit of shade cloth exposed here, and this will all get seeded up once the water recedes and it's not quite so wet. So that shade cloth actually goes into the concrete. It goes down about 300 millimeters into the ground under the formwork, and then the concrete is poured and the concrete attaches to the shade cloth so that it can't be pulled out, so that when you put a bit of dirt over the shade cloth, and even if you do get so much water that it washes away the dirt, the shade cloth will stay there and it can't move because it's held in by the concrete. Now, because this wall is higher than my previous wall, I put a few logs in place where the wall is higher, just to break some of the fall. Logs just held in place with a few little star pickets. You can see the overflow of the weir is spread out over a very large area. So that is the other way of minimising any erosion caused by it. And the real beauty of this sort of weir is it does absolute minimal impact on the environment. This area here, you can see I didn't dig a hole at all. It's 1.2 meters deep in the gully there, and the water actually goes back up into the long grass. The water, yes, the actual surface area of the weir is a lot bigger than what it looks because it's going right up into that grass. This weir is only been completed for 2 or 3 weeks, and yet everything looks very natural. Not as natural as the other one because I still had to do a bit of earthworks here, whereas the previous one down here you can see how natural that looks. With minimum environmental impact. The great thing about this sort of weir is that although it's a lot of work making the formwork, and that's by far the biggest part of it, is making the formwork and figuring out how to do that. I built this smaller one first. It's only 700 millimeters high, so I could do it all in one concrete pour, and I learnt and experimented with that a little bit. Some of the ways I built the formwork was a little bit different in some places than others to see what worked best, and with what I learnt from that one, I made the new weir up here, and that's been a learning process as well. But the good thing, and one of the things that I aimed for, was to try and produce something that is easier to build for the average person. This weir, all it requires, you can do it with one person. I basically did all of this on my own, and I just got a friend to come in and help me when the concrete was being poured. I have a little trench digger, but you can rent them pretty easily. That'll dig a trench to about 800 millimeters or about a yard deep. And so you can just rent one of those, dig the trench, you build the formwork and do all the reinforcing and stuff like that, and you just get somebody in to help you pour the concrete. And so the main cost of it was the formwork and the concrete, but the formwork is all reusable. So most of the formwork that I used making this one was all used in making this one, although I had to buy more formwork because parts of this were higher, so I needed bigger formwork for this. Now, when you're considering the strength of this one here was reaching, really with these sort of things, the foundation needs to be as deep as what the wall is high. But this one is higher than it is deep. It's only 800 deep and it's 1200 millimeters high. So I put that bend in the wall. That greatly strengthens it. That supports the wall and gives it a lot more strength, and it's less likely to tip over, putting that bend in the wall. It makes the formwork more complicated in that particular spot, but it greatly improves the strength. The construction of the formwork for a concrete weir takes quite a bit of work to get it well. The process involves putting spacers, so you can see there's holes in the formwork. Where you put these spacers through, and that stops holds the formwork in place, and you're left with, you can punch these back out of the concrete after it's set, and then you can just fill it with cement to seal the holes. So once you pull the formwork off, you're left with all holes of this sort of size right through the concrete, but they're quite easily filled with cement. Now, to seal it to the ground, because where you're constructing things, it doesn't tend to be terribly flat and things, so with uneven ground, and sometimes and often where you're using the trencher, it breaks out the top of the trench. So I put a foot on the bottom of the formwork, just like that, and what I put is some plastic that's actually in between the foot and there, so it's screwed in from the other side. Now, the purpose of this plastic is billboard skins, recycled billboard skins. It's basically vinyl coated cloth. So it's quite strong, and so I just lay the whole thing on top of the trench, and then the dirt that's been dug out of the trench gets backfilled onto here. You can see it's been filled up to this depth, this height, and that you can also push it in under here, because it's not always flat, so that you can so you have gaps under here where the concrete would leak out, so you can push dirt in under there, and then you just build a decent weight of dirt on top of it to stop it lifting off the ground when you pour concrete into it, because concrete's very heavy and it could actually lift the formwork off the ground, so you need to hold the formwork in place very solidly. And I actually used sump oil on the formwork to so that it didn't stick to the concrete, And in some places where there might have been any potential places where it could stick, I actually used grease. And then where you join the formwork together, I just screw pieces of board over the top of it. You can see the screw holes there, and I just grease them up before I screw them on, and they come off, and then the whole thing can be pulled off. You got to be careful thinking about it. After the concrete sets, after it's been there for a few hours, it's probably best to go down and dig down here, because sometimes concrete can sort of squeeze up through here, or in a few spots, or especially on the joins here where you join it down here. You can get a little bit of concrete seep through there, and it can trap the plastic in there. So a couple of hours after the concrete's been poured, I go through and I dig out this section of the dirt, and while the concrete is still reasonably soft, I dig out any bits of it that could potentially cause it to get caught there. The first weir I did, I had those sort of issues, and then I went with this system with the second weir, and so I didn't have those sort of issues, and it worked very well. So then you need somewhere to store all your formwork for the next weir that you're going to build. If you were only to build one leaky weir, the thing is that it might only take 3 months or something for it to drain. However, it could still keep the surrounding soils moist for another 6 months, so maybe 9 months of the year. But what I'm doing here is to try and put in numerous leaky weirs such that each one leaks in or overflows into the one below it. The idea that I'm working on is to turn a normally dry gully into a permanent watercourse, with flowing water, having a trickle of water flowing down through the gully all year, so there will always be a little bit of water going into the river that this gully ultimately flows into. So it's helping with environmental flows in the river by catching water during the flood times and releasing it with a slow trickle during the dry times. So it's helping the river system as well as watering my plants. You can see over here I've got rainforest trees planted that are all being watered by these weirs. And of course, the real beauty of doing this as compared to a dam is firstly that you don't create a lot of damage because you've dug a big hole. This is one of the ones where I did dig a big hole to get the material to build this wall. This one I didn't, and you can see that's all reeds growing in there. That's the sort of reeds that you use for thatching roofs. So if I ever wanted to build a thatched roof, I've got loads of reeds there. At one point during the construction of the formwork, we had a lot of rain that filled up the trench with water and mud and stuff, and I found that a wet and dry vacuum cleaner with a long piece of tube attached worked particularly well for sucking out the water and the mud from the bottom of the trench. Also in this image you can see the support supports that are attached to stakes in the ground to ensure that the formwork stays vertical during the pouring of the concrete. At the top of the formwork here you can see some aluminium angle which has been placed using the laser level. So when we're pouring the concrete is filled up and adjusted in level to the same level as the aluminium angle, and that produces the top of the concrete all pretty level all the way across the entire weir.